Chapter 8. Miss Mortis. Silence set in as David Scott opened his eyes to the darkness, and his heart felt as if it had doubled in size. It was pounding in his chest like an unborn chick raging against the eggshell from the inside. Each beat seemed to resonate, and he tried to slow his breathing down to not be heard, as his heart set a pounding drum beat against his sternum, trying to focus his eyes to the darkness ahead. Confess your sins. A loud, bold, almost growling voice stated as David fell into darkness. He had seen a bright light glowing from the distance and started walking toward it. "What is this?" he questioned. There was no reply, only silence. He questioned his own mind as he noticed there was not even the slightest echo stirring from his own voice in this long, dark, eerie hallway. It was almost like talking through a pillow, smothering his face. His mind started taking him back to his last moment before death. A silent gasp lets out into the cold sky, followed by the steam. The coldness of his last breath pours into the air as he bled profusely out onto the leaf-topped ground. "I was murdered," he questioned himself. "How ironic is that?" He raised his voice. Still, there was only silence to follow. "Okay, my sin is that I killed. I was a hitman, a problem solver of sorts," he stated while still looking toward the light. The voice still didn't come back. His eyes had set focus back on the dim light that had barely broke the darkness at the other end of the hallway. There had been no shadows or sounds of movement as his eye darted around the hallway, trying to locate the voice. With still nothing or no one in sight, he started to creep slowly toward the light with his back to the wall, which grew brighter with each step. He noticed a door with a brass plate on it that read, "Primitive." He reached out for the knob when he heard a fluttering sound come from another door across the way that had a brass plate that read, "Processor." David looked back from the direction of which he came from, but could only see darkness. He slowly walked over to the other door and inched the doorknob open, trying not to make a sound. "Fuck this. It's been real nice talking to you. I guess I'll go get processed in now," he hollered in sarcasm. Once the doorknob counter clocked as far as it would, he flung the door open and jumped inside to catch the voice he had heard. There was no one in sight as the sound of the door slammed behind him. He turned just in time to watch the door melt into the wall like liquid, falling into cracks and disappearing. His eyes had gone from the hunter to quickly falling lifeless. The room's light was tinted blue. The walls were tattered and torn rock. The floor was also rock, with burnt grass blades captured in the cracks of mortar. The sound of chains hindered his mind from capturing the realization of this ghostly, haunted, castle-style room. Fearing entrapment of the room, he quickly started clawing at the walls, trying to find his escape. "Fuck!" he cried out as one of his fingernails ripped back and started trickling blood onto the floor. He closed his fist and started pounding the rock's surface, but the stones didn't give an inch. Finally, he sat down on the floor with his back resting against the wall to gather a new game plan. He started panning the room, looking for any hope of getting out when he remembered the sound of the chains. He got to his feet and wandered to the wall until his eyes met the dangling chains. They weren't just chains. They were old-style handcuffs they used to use in torture chambers. He grabbed one and started pulling, but it had no give. He placed his feet firmly on the wall while holding himself up by the chain and used his body weight and leg strength to work in his benefit. He heaved the chain with all his might, with still no luck in sight. His hands gave in and he fell straight down, landing on his tailbone. At the time he was about to give up, there was a shimmering light coming from the far wall. He got to his feet once again and started walking over to it. It was a knife. He quickly grabbed it and pulled it with ease from the wall. The whole room started to shake, leaving small particles of stones and mortar dust falling from the ceiling above. David lost balance and fell back from the shaking room. He placed his hand that held the knife behind him to try to catch himself, and the knife pierced his back, leaving him unable to move. I, 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 I see you. A whispering voice echoed around the room. David's heart started thumping harder and harder as his body felt as if it was going through some sort of paralysis. He tried to scream out at the whisper, but only short bursts of groaning had come out. His eyes rolled to the top of his head, trying to see what was coming toward him that was walking all contorted. It was a naked female, with only strands of barbed wire covering her breasts and waist. The barbed wire ran down her arms and between her legs. Her skin was a corpse color with a bluish tone, and her hair was long and black as the darkest night. She walked with a limp as she took a step forward with one leg dragging to the side and then kicking the other forward. She leaned over David's face with her dark eyes and contorted her head from side to side, while her neck stayed stable and her contorted legs straddled him. I, 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 I see you, she whispered over him. He tried to scream again, but nothing would reach the surface from his voice. She reached under him and pulled the butcher knife from his back and slid it lightly down his chest, which cut a small slit through his shirt. She tore it, pulling it across the sides, and laid it over the side of him. David was scared out of his wits, but couldn't help but start to get a hard on. He had killed for so long that it was the only excitement that turned him on. She reached down and grabbed a handful of cock through his pants as she slid her body side to side in almost a snake-like motion. She squeezed down hard before releasing the button on his pants and ripping them back from between her legs and throwing them behind her in almost a hiking motion, which left him completely naked, minus the shirt torn open barely hanging onto his arms. She placed the knife in his hand and clenched her hand around it to allow him a firm grip, and lifted his arm up to run the knife across her neck. Blood started to flow and trickled down his chest. She then laid his hand back to rest onto the floor, and she climbed on top of him. She bent the barbed wire to the side from the center of her pussy and inserted him into her. She started slowly going up and down in a cowgirl position, running his cock in and out of her. With every downward motion, the barbed wire would drive into the inside of his legs. She started quickening the pace, slamming the barbs of the wire into his legs as the blood still dripped from her and her barbed wire covered breast bounced up and down as the barbs pierced her skin. She then flopped her body onto his and started driving his cock in further while leaving gashes across his stomach and chest as if razor blades were being dragged across his body. He was still unable to scream out, but tears started to fall from his desperate eyes, casting reflections of the horror on top of him as she used his own hand to drag the knife across the ground, which was shooting sparks over them. She thrust it a few more good times before her eyes widened and her body arced backward. She let out a ghostly moan of satisfaction with her mouth in an O shape that was filled with colorations of darkness. She started to rise up far enough to only leave a little more than the head of his cock still inserted inside of her. She grabbed her butcher's knife from his hand and cut his whole cock off from its base. She stood up, yet still in a squat, and ran it inside her a few times, and then pulled it out and licked the tip in a circular motion before taking it in full. Blood started soaking the ground from David's wounds. He was still conscious, but not far from complete shock. She guided his cock in and out of her mouth like enjoying an innocent lollipop while watching him bleed. Her neck started healing itself up, but her blood that had spilled on him still remained and started eating at his wounds like gasoline to a styrofoam cup. His moans started coming back and got louder and louder. She slammed the cock into his mouth and cupped his mouth and nose until he swallowed it down. It stopped in the middle of his throat, leaving a huge lump blocking his airway. She contortedly walked back to the wall and stabbed the knife back into the mortar and rock. Her body slowly disappeared as David's body slowly dissolved into nothing. Grass grew where his body had laid and caught fire, leaving more burnt blades of grass behind. The room went completely quiet, and once again